All right, so we're jumping headfirst into Prime Minister Christopher Luxon's diplomatic tour. Kind of wild, right? He's been all over Southeast Asia, meeting with a ton of world leaders, and there's this RNZ article that's giving us a behind-the-scenes look. So picture this. Luxon's in Laos for the East Asia Summit.
Yeah, like a big diplomacy conference.
Exactly, and he's there to make some serious connections.
It's interesting how he's using the summit as a way to push New Zealand's interests, It's not just about the summit itself. He's got all these side meetings, dinners, the whole 9 yards, like a full-on diplomatic blitz.
And speaking of full-on, the big meeting everyone's talking about is the one with India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. This wasn't just a quick handshake. Before even meeting with him, Luxon was really talking up the potential for New Zealand and India, especially when it comes to trade.
Yeah, well, and that ties back to a big promise Luxon's party, the National Party, made during their campaign. They said they'd get a free trade agreement, or FTA, with India.
Sounds easy enough.
Way more complicated than it sounds.
Yeah, the article talks about all these roadblocks to actually getting that FTA signed. It seems like every time we get close, things fall apart. What's the sticking point?
It boils down to, well, dairy. New Zealand's a huge dairy producer, and India, with their own massive agricultural industry, has always been really hesitant to let New Zealand dairy products in. It's been a point of contention for years, and it's a great example of how domestic interests complicate things on the world stage.
So it's not just about two leaders signing a piece of paper. It's about navigating these deep economic realities, too.
Definitely.
The article talks about Luxon trying to find that balance, acknowledging how tough it is, but still sounding hopeful. Feels like he's assuring voters back home without making promises he can't keep.
He's walking a tightrope for sure. And as you can imagine, back in New Zealand, the opposition is having a field day. They're calling this FTA a pipe dream and saying that National made it seem way too simple during the campaign.
So we've got political drama back home, economic realities in India, and then all this pressure to get this FTA done. Even with all that, though, the article mentions all these high-level meetings that have been happening between New Zealand and Indian officials.
Right, and that's an important point. That's the thing about diplomacy. A lot of it is about playing the long game. Sometimes it's a win just to have that engagement, that relationship building.
Yeah.
Even if an agreement isn't signed, it lays the groundwork for progress later on, even if it's slow going.
So even if they don't finalize an FTA during this trip, just getting that FaceTime with Modi is a win in itself. Strategically, I mean.
100%. Think of it like this. You can't expect to hash out every detail of a trade deal like this in one meeting, right? It's about building trust, figuring out where each other stands, and opening those lines of communication for the future.
So we know getting that FTA with India is complicated. But this is where Luxon's trip gets even more interesting. This RNZ article, it talks about all these other meetings he's having, kind of like he's on a diplomatic speed dating spree.
Right. Leaders from Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, even a quick chat with his counterparts from Australia and Canada. It's a lot.
This is Luxon playing chess, global politics chess. He's not just fixated on this one thing, the FTA. He's building a network, Southeast Asia is becoming a bigger player every day, economically and in terms of global power. This is about New Zealand staying relevant.
So it's bigger than just trade deals then. What's the strategy here?
Imagine it like this. China and the U.S., they're both trying to exert influence in the region, right? Smaller countries, like New Zealand, they benefit from having good relationships with everyone. It's about having a say, a place at the table, making sure their interests aren't ignored.
And this article, it shows us how those relationships are actually formed. It's not always in those formal settings with agendas and whatnot. It mentions a fancy dinner Luxon went to. He's there with big names, Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, even Li Qiang, the Chinese premier, all in one room. Those informal settings, those are sometimes where the real work gets done. The side conversations, building up that rapport, That doesn't make headlines, but it can make or break a negotiation later down the line.
It's like they say, it's not what you say, it's how you make people feel, right? That trust, that respect, that's huge in diplomacy.
100%. At the end of the day, diplomacy is about people. World leaders, different backgrounds, different priorities, trying to find common ground.
Speaking of common ground, the article does mention a little scheduling mishap. Seems like a meeting with Laos's own prime minister got canceled. Delays, you know how it goes.
It happens. In that world, everything's meticulously planned. But sometimes life throws a curveball. All those leaders, back-to-back schedules, last-minute changes, it's a lot of pressure.
It's kind of comforting, actually. Even world leaders deal with canceled meetings and logistical nightmares. Makes you feel a little better about missing that flight because you forgot to set an alarm.
We've all been there. But it does show the human side of things.
So we've got these trade negotiations, power dynamics, even a little bit of diplomatic drama. But let's bring it back to our listeners for a second. Why should they care about Luxon's trip? These meetings are happening halfway across the world. What's the takeaway?
It's easy to think about international relations as like this big abstract thing, but it really does matter for us, regular people, right?
Yeah, for sure. Think about it like the connections New Zealand makes on the world stage, whether it's India, China, or even just closer to home, it all affects how well off we are economically, you know?
Okay, so like trade deals, those impact us.
Exactly. Trade deals, they influence like what we pay for things, even
Yeah.
what's on the shelves at the supermarket. It's all connected.
So that sail and cheese I just got, that's thanks to good diplomacy.
Well, maybe not directly. But you get the idea. And it's not just the economy either. It's also about security, New Zealand's place in the world. With everything going on, climate change, political tensions, having strong relationships is even more important. It's like if you've got a good support system, you're more prepared to handle whatever life throws at you. Same idea, but on a global scale.
Exactly. So when you hear about Luxon's trip, all those meetings, it's not just for show. It's about making sure those relationships are strong, that they benefit New Zealand in the long run.
So this R&Z article about Luxon's tour, what we're learning is it's not as simple as just, I don't know, showing up and shaking hands. There's a lot going on behind the scenes.
A lot. And look, we can argue about how successful this specific trip was, but one thing's for sure, New Zealand and India, especially when it comes to trade, that's going to be important to watch. If you want to know what New Zealand's priorities are, keep an eye on that relationship.
It's a good reminder that, like, things are constantly changing in global politics. Always something new happening.
And every meeting, every summit, it all has the potential to change things.
That's a wrap on this week's deep dive into New Zealand's place on the world stage. Hopefully, this is giving you a little insight into how those global handshakes translate into real-world effects back home. Until next time, stay curious and remember, even world leaders deal with canceled flights.